This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This week on Off the Record, no vaccines, no quarantines, no masking, no tracing. What is going on in some suburban school districts, and what is the state planning to do about it? Meanwhile, at CMS, a COVID test every week for teachers who aren't vaccinated, and COVID test appointments are getting harder to find and longer to wait for at Charlotte's crowded urgent care centers. City Council gets a report on how many homeless are in Charlotte, and the homeless get a new shelter in town. Veto politics in Raleigh, the fight over critical race theory in the classroom, and jail time for protesters on the streets. And school for sale, or maybe not, as a neighborhood tries to protect its historic all-black school building. Plus, Picasso comes to Charlotte. But what's the Picasso price tag for taxpayers? Lots to talk about next on PBS Charlotte. And from our PBS Charlotte studios in historic Plaza Midwood, I'm Jeff Sonnier, and we're off the record talking about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, and listen to the news, well, you'll recognize the names and faces around our virtual table. Eli Portillo from the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, Danielle Shemtob from Axios Charlotte, and Tony Messia from the Charlotte Ledger. You can also join the conversation from home. Just email your questions and comments to offtherecord at WTVI.org. Well, it looks like we've got a showdown coming between at least one of Charlotte's suburban school systems and the state over COVID testing and quarantines. In Union County this week, they made yet another what would be described as controversial decision regarding how they're dealing with the COVID crisis in that particular school system. I know all three of you are parents. Some of you are school parents. Any of you want to kick in first on what Union County is doing or isn't doing and how that fits into the whole scheme of fighting COVID at this point?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, what you're seeing is most school districts in the state have followed the state's recommendations and guidance and said, listen, we want the students masked. We want to quarantine them according to what the state is recommending. Union County has come out since, in the last few weeks and has said, we're going to make the masks optional. And the problem was under those rules, they were quarantining a whole bunch of students. I think it was a huge percentage. Was it a fifth or a third of the students were quarantined? So the school board came out this week and said, well, actually, we're going to disregard those recommendations on the quarantining, and everybody can kind of go back to school. So you have a bunch of students who are back, and they are a lot are not masked, and they are, if they are exposed, are not quarantining. And so the state this week came in and said, Secretary Mandy Cohen, the Health and Human Services Director, said, listen, you guys really need to get with the program here, or the state's going to crack down. So she was, threatening and say, listen, this is a serious health issue, and you need to do it the right way. Lincoln County also, I think, has gone mask optional. Haven't come under the eye of the state just yet, but certainly some showdowns.
Right. Lincoln County dropped their mask mandate this week as well. I think them and Union are one of two of four counties in the entire state, the only four counties in the state, school systems that aren't doing masking. And the number you were looking for, 7,000 quarantined students in Union County allowed to go back to school because of the decision by Union County this week. Danielle, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a parent, but that's okay.
But I'm sorry about that. You're right. My mistake. My mistake. Go ahead.
So, I think it's a really interesting contrast with CMS, right? One of the first to mandate masks, and of course has had, much stricter policies, even, mandating vaccines for employees this week. So I think that it's really interesting to look at. It really exemplifies the urban-rural divide and the partisan divide in a way that's defined this whole crisis. Just comparing the two responses of, lax perhaps on health restrictions and the opposite. And I think that's part of this politicization that's happened in this country with the pandemic.
Yeah, each board seems to be using the pandemic to further its political beliefs, or the individual members obviously have strong political beliefs, and that is kind of translating into COVID decisions. Eli?
Yeah, I think that this illustrates that, given the condition, either have or not quarantine, but you can't have masks and follow the quarantine rules. You know, you kind of have to either pick one or the other, or it's not going to be able to be possible to operate a school district. I mean, with that many kids in quarantine already because of maskless exposure, just logistically, it's not possible to keep operating the school district with that going on all the time. You know, in Dr. Cohen's letter to the Union County schools, she said that there's already higher COVID than in among children than in similar sized communities, counties around North Carolina. And I think that, you know, we'll see what happens with the showdown in terms of what the state can force them to do. At the time of this taping, I don't think Union County has responded to that yet. But for better or worse, we are also setting up a natural experiment here.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people, you know, fervently pointing to studies, kind of cherry picking advice to say masks don't work. We're going to see if this policy continues, what those rates look like and how the schools function and how many clusters of kids there are infected and all that. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing experiment now. It's early in the school year, but we see CMS, which started a week later, but also started with a absolute mask mandate policy, and their infection rate among students it's present, but it's much lower than it is in other school systems. Certainly lower than it is in Union County. I think they said Union County has triple the rate of what Mecklenburg County has right now, even though the school system in Mecklenburg County is much larger. And speaking of CMS, teachers will start getting tests next week if they don't have the vaccine, and that's another policy that the school system has instituted this year. And again, with the success they've had so far, I would think CMS probably feels pretty good about the plan they're on and the direction they're headed right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're pretty happy with it. I mean, the numbers, as you pointed out, are low. I mean, there have been a number of studies that show that it is possible to educate students in classrooms, you know, if they're masked, if they follow, you know, certain guidelines, and, you know, they're in CMS and a lot of other districts working to do that. You know, the hospitals have also come out and said, you know, they're seeing a larger number of COVID cases among children. Typically, they're not serious cases. They do have some hospitalizations. The number of deaths of children, the pediatric deaths of COVID are extremely low. But of course, the fear is that, you know, you spread it to teachers who are not vaccinated, or you spread it, you know, you bring it home to the family and maybe have an elderly, you know, family member who's vulnerable. And so, you know, so I think this, you know, this move by CMS to, you know, to get the testing in line, you know, it's just sort of another step in how we're, you know, dealing with this disease.
Yeah, I think LA Unified School District in California on a step further, I believe, in mandated weekly testing for everyone, vaccinated or not, because they want to catch, you know, asymptomatic breakthrough cases and those kinds of infections. But I think it's going to be interesting as more places adopt these mandates and start really enforcing them on unvaccinated employees, and how the testing capacity keeps up for that. You know, CMS officials were saying we haven't conducted anything on this scale before. Just logistically, we've already started to see test times, I think, that are longer, and long waits for tests. We've seen decreased availability of rapid tests in some places. So I think, how do we keep up with this? How long does it take to turn these results around? What do you do in the interim? There's going to be a lot of nuts and bolts questions about these programs, not just at CMS, but at many large employers that are mandating this kind of testing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that CMS is opening their testing, by the way, to students as well. They're allowing students to take part in the weekly testing program that teachers will be required to take part in if they don't have the vaccine. And that almost gives this a sense of kind of a shared responsibility, or an opportunity, if you will, for some of these families to make sure their kids are tested and healthy as they go to school from week to week. Danielle?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's something you're going to start seeing a lot more with the Biden executive order. Yeah. And, you know, I think testing capacity is an issue, but of course, I'm interested to just know how many people will turn around and get vaccinated. I mean, there was a lot of conversation about, people will quit their jobs, et cetera. Of course, now that it's, required everywhere, I can't imagine that that's going to be too common. So, I think it's a question of, will people want to go through, it's creating, more and more hassle for unvaccinated people intentionally, right? So I think it's, will people want to go through this testing? I'm sure there will be a rise in testing. And as Eli pointed out, there's already, a crunch as it is with the testing lines and everything. But I think it'll be interesting to see how the vaccination numbers change over the next couple weeks as people say, well, I guess I have to do this because my employer is requiring me to. And CMS is one of many.
Yeah, by the way, I think at the school board on Tuesday night, they talked about whether this OSHA rule that is coming from Washington is going to apply to the school system. North Carolina, one of the states that has an OSHA approved safety program. And so the schools are waiting to see if OSHA kind of takes the lead on this thing and forces them to do what CMS is already requiring them to do as a school system. And that is either to vaccinate or get that weekly test among their staffers. Speaking of testing, by the way, Tony, the Ledger did a story this week about how difficult it is to get a test right now. Kind of looking back to those days in January and February after Christmas when it was hard to find an opportunity. I guess we're kind of back there now too, right?
Well, it is getting a little tricky. I mean, there are a number of, with these numbers being at an elevated level, there are a lot of people who want to get, who want to get tested. And the story we did just looked at urgent care centers and sort of the ripple effect that COVID is having in urgent care. We know that hospitalizations are fairly high. Hospitals are trying to manage, their regular patients along with COVID patients in a time of year when it's usually not that busy in hospitals, but it's also affecting places like urgent care where people go in to get tested, and it's creating huge delays and backlogs. You think of urgent care as somewhere you go, you can break your leg playing soccer, what have you. You go right in. It's not like that anymore. You have to wait several hours now. Typically, you might have to go online and make an appointment at urgent care. You might not be able to get in the same day. So, the effect of this virus is really sort of rippling through the healthcare industry and making it hard to get in and get treatment in a timely way in many cases.
Yeah, kind of clogging that pipeline. It's not quite so urgent in terms of actually getting the care when all those COVID patients are kind of squeezing you out of line. Eli?
Yeah, I had to visit an urgent care for a non-COVID related reason with my toddler recently, and there was we were able to get in. We did, have to make an appointment for the next day at midnight. So there was kind of crowded, but there was a big sign on the door. The urgent care in South Park said, no rapid COVID tests, don't come in for seeking that. And still during the brief time that we were in the waiting room, people were walking in and saying, can I get a rapid COVID test? I need to see if I have COVID. Someone said their employer required it. And, people were coming in seeking that, and they were being told, we don't have rapid tests here. You got to go somewhere else. So I will say it seems like it's more difficult to get those tests than it should be, especially if we are requiring them. Also, as someone who's a parent of an unvaccinated kid who had to take him to an urgent care for something else, it's a little worrisome when you're sitting there in the waiting room and there's people who think they have COVID wandering in trying to get rapid tests. So, I mean, it's a very weird situation right now. And frankly, it felt more like last summer than this summer at times.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like we're back to the future in terms of the kinds of things we were feeling in January and February after the Christmas break and the COVID spike. It almost feels like we're back there again for different reasons, but back there nonetheless. A couple of other quick items. Harris Teeter reducing their hours at stores because of a lack of workers. Duke Energy delaying their back-to-work plans by at least a month because of the spike in COVID. And Amazon hiring 3,500 new employees in the Charlotte area, in part because of that continued surge of online buying among those who maybe feel less than comfortable going to stores or dealing with public situations these days. Let's change gears and talk about the report that the City Council got this week regarding the homeless population in the city. Kind of an invisible problem, maybe because we don't want to see it. But Eli, you wrote about that this week for the Urban Institute, about those numbers and how they are rising again.
Yeah, so, the City Council got a report this week that the number of homeless people in the city on any given night, kind of this one number that they tout is about more than 3,100 now. And that's an increase of over 1,100 over the past year. So it's really, you're talking about more than a 50% jump in people experiencing homelessness. And, there's a consortium of local agencies, nonprofits, government agencies, leading a new 5-year strategic plan for dealing with homelessness. And that's what they plan to roll out sometime in October. And it's really, I think, a problem that if we were in normal times, whatever that might mean, would be getting a lot more attention. I mean, a 50% spike in people experiencing homelessness in 1 year is really big, but there's been so much else this past year, obviously, that I think it's somewhat flown under the radar. The new strategy that they're getting ready, it has a goal of not eliminating homelessness, but rather making it rare, brief, and non-reoccurring, I believe is the way they put it.
Yeah, and some of the report mentioned how the homeless problem is intertwined with other problems, like the high cost of housing and what we expect to be an upcoming surge in evictions because of the expiration of those moratoriums due to COVID. You've written a lot about evictions, Danielle. It's only going to exacerbate the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating that number, it's 3,150 that Eli was mentioning, kind of point in time count. That's higher than any point in 2020 when it was the height of this crisis, right? But you had some, government stimulus programs, of course, and now you're seeing the unemployment benefits wane. You're seeing the evictions restart, and I think it just shows how this crisis is far from over, despite we wanted it to be and how we were feeling earlier this summer, and kind of the economic outlook. But it just this is far from over. I mean, people are still unemployed. People still can't afford housing. They're behind on rent. There are these rental assistance programs, but as we've written about and talked about, I believe, on the show before, there's huge backlogs to getting money in many cities. And in Charlotte's been a little better, but still, tons of applicants and just a long line to get that money. So, I mean, I think it's just going to get worse, unfortunately. Yeah,
the numbers are higher than they were last year when Tent City was very visible on the side of Brookshire Freeway, and yet the attention that was given to Tent City when it was there is not there now, when we're seeing these rising numbers in this report and perhaps a plan to deal with this. And I know the folks who deal with homeless population talk about this all the time. It's one of those, it's not an invisible problem because it's there, but it's almost a problem, as I mentioned, people don't want to see until it's literally right in their face, right, out the window of their car. How much of this, homelessness doesn't really touch us when we have homes? How much of this problem is due to the fact that it's not one of those problems that people maybe feel personally?
I think that that's definitely true. It's kind of easy, especially if you don't live in a neighborhood that has a lot of visible homelessness, to just say, see that number and move on. I think in a lot of ways this can be a somewhat problem too. You have people who are living in shelters. Maybe they're sleeping on someone's floor at someone's house where they're crashing for a while. So I think people often conflate only street homelessness with all homelessness, but really, it's a much bigger issue than that. And one thing that I think is interesting in how decision makers and the movers and shakers are approaching this now is you're hearing a lot of talk about focusing upstream, and that means really preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place. That, I think, is going to be one of the big focuses of this plan. Michael Smith, the CEO of Center City Partners, said that the previous strategy, Housing First Charlotte Mecklenburg, which really focused on helping chronically homeless get into supportive housing, that got more than 1,000 people. That worked, but the way Michael Smith put it was we were not keeping up with the number of people who were losing their homes in this environment of rising housing costs, record home prices, rapidly rising rent. So, we've really got to focus on this, I think, as more of an overall system problem
Right.
than just, can we get people who are experiencing visible street homelessness into a motel or something?
Yeah, it's all,
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, as you mentioned, I mean, there are just so many pieces of this. I mean, it's not just, oh, we need more shelters, or, oh, we need better, drug and alcohol treatment programs, or, oh, we need to solve the price of housing. It's really all of those things and a lot of other things too. Because I mean, like many other issues, there's very rarely just a single cause. So it's really it's a thorny problem. It's a problem a lot of cities are dealing with, and just requires a lot of outside the box kind of thinking and the work of a lot of people.
Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you both said is absolutely true. I mean, for one, there's so many people living in motels. Often we don't think about that as homelessness, or maybe you don't see them, of course, because they're in hotels as opposed to on the streets. But that is a major issue, and they don't have the there's questions over whether they have the same protections as regular tenants. During the moratorium, there were questions over that. Now, of course, the moratorium's over, so that wouldn't apply to them regardless. But I also think that it's all a cycle, right? I mean, you have, take the evictions. It's not just someone gets thrown on the street. It's almost impossible to get an apartment after that. I mean, that's one of the issues. If you've been looking at or following some of the conversations about rehousing some of the people from Tent City, those have been some of the issues that have come up. They have an eviction, or they have a criminal record, or different things. These things follow you for the rest of your life.
Right.
And then it's all a cycle. It makes it more difficult to get housing again, and then you stay homeless. So I think it's really just addressing all of these factors before they start.
Yeah, one good bit of homeless news this week: a new shelter by Roof Above on Statesville Avenue opening this week. 164 more beds, socially distanced pods, resources for job hunting and house hunting. So another resource in the community, but certainly a problem that outstrips the resources right now, and really difficult to find a real solution because it is such a varied type of problem. A lot of different causes, a lot of different victims here. I want to move on to the Morgan School in Cherry neighborhood. A lot of folks don't know it's there, but it once was a school 100 years ago that taught primarily African Americans. It provided the education for African Americans in Charlotte, and that building has been abandoned. It's been empty since 2017, and now developers are looking closely at getting a shot at it. Anyone want to take first swipe at this kind of back and forth between the neighborhood that wants to save its historic building and the developers who'd like to have that historic building and maybe turn it into something new?
Well, there was a plan. I don't believe it was developers. The school system was going to lease it to an arts nonprofit, but the community has been trying to buy the building. They've been saying that they've been expressing interest for a long time in buying the building. It's important, monument, as you just mentioned, in a community that has a long, rich history. And so, they basically had protests and came out to public forums. And ultimately this week, CMS said they were going to sell the building rather than lease it. So it remains to be seen whether the community would be the ones to buy it. But in theory, they could potentially purchase it if they were to make a bid. So, we'll see what happens from here. But it's really, kind of I think emblematic of this struggle around gentrification and maintaining landmarks in historically Black neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think Cherry's one of those neighborhoods where every time a property changes hands, the neighbors who live there wonder if their neighborhood is kind of slipping through their fingers. Eli?
Yeah, and the Cherry is really emblematic of gentrification and just, community change. If you drive through there, a huge number of the houses have been torn down and replaced with much larger 800, 900,000 square foot, or not square foot, dollar properties. So there's already been a ton of change in that neighborhood. And, as Danielle, this is far from the only place where this is happening. You also see similar questions we've seen over the Excelsior Club, for example, the historically African-American social club on the west side. We've been talking for years about what happened to Brooklyn and Second Ward, and the plans to replace a lot of that empty land with a new development called Brooklyn Village, and how would the former residents and the history of that neighborhood that was wiped out to make way for the government district be represented. So in a lot of ways, I think we're still seeing the ramifications and the attempts to correct, injustices that were caused many decades ago. And this is one piece of trying to wrestle with that history of segregation, urban renewal, and all those historical currents we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say this in particular. I mean, these neighborhoods near Uptown, you're really seeing this a lot. You're seeing this over in Wesley Heights, Fremont West area, Seversville. You're seeing this down in Cherry, which is south of Kings. There's a lot of development going down there, and it's not just residential housing, or people buying houses and making them bigger, knocking them down. I mean, you have a residential tower that's going into the Metropolitan, which is right by Cherry. You have another proposal for another tower just down the street at Kings. This is an area that's close to Myers Park. It's close to Moorhead, Providence Road area. So there's just a lot of development pressures. And so how do you keep residents, longtime residents, in these neighborhoods when the land prices are just accelerating like crazy, and everybody wants to build something near Uptown? You see all that development, at the hospital that Atrium is doing over there, off behind Moorhead, Pearl Street Park. I mean, there's just so much going on. It's so close. It's such a prime area, so close to Uptown, and you're seeing that just all over those inner ring neighborhoods.
Yeah, and if you've lived in those neighborhoods for any length of time, you see what you had or what you are used to slipping away, and that is difficult in particular for a lot of these neighborhoods, in particular how quickly that change comes as well. Well, as usual, we've got more topics than we've got time. We didn't get a chance to talk about the Picasso exhibition coming to the Mint Museum, but we will, because City Council, I believe, will take that up again in terms of helping to fund that issue. And also the governor's vetoes this week of two controversial bills. We'll see what the Republican-controlled legislature does with those vetoes in the next week or two, and probably revisit that topic as well. But in the meantime, I want to thank our gang for joining us this week. A good discussion, and if you enjoyed it, or maybe even if you didn't, give us your comments and questions at offtherecord@WTVI.org. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time on Off the Record.
A production of PBS Charlotte.